Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in Washington, D.C., the U.S. arm of the London-based think tank. Every year, IISS issues its Military Balance, a global survey of defense trends looking at 2016, pointing out some trends to look at for 2017. It's one of the world's most accurate and complete assessments of global military power, looking at economic factors as well as developments on air, land, and sea. And we're honored to have with us the editor of the Military Balance, James Hackett. James, thanks very much for joining us.
No problem, Vago. Thanks very much for having us.
I want to start off, you guys take a survey. What are some of the key trends that you saw in 2016 that should be shaping what's on people's agendas in 2017?
I think there are, two watchwords really: change and continuity. What's changed? Greater focus on alliance relationships. What are the benefits of working together, and how to develop a greater response to the challenge of what to do more of in terms of burden sharing? I think those are going to be key debates at the NATO ministerial in Brussels. And also, let me just talk about continuity, because I don't think that there's been a really significant change in the drivers for global defense policy and security operations. Conflicts still continue around the world. Instability is still a prime driver of military deployments. And more broadly, the weight of military spending and capability development is shifting east. China's budget keeps rising. The Asian budget we've traced from 2015 to 16's increased 5 to 6% in those 2 years. In 2012, Asia surpassed Europe for the first time in defense spending. Asia is now 1.3 times greater than Europe in terms of spending. And it's not just spending, it's in capability development. I think we're seeing some really interesting trends. Of course, there's a lot of focus on what Russia's doing in terms of its use of guided weapons. But in many senses, the developments there were started in the 1980s. We're now seeing those systems coming to fruition and used operationally, yes. But some of the developments in China we think are particularly interesting. There's more indigenous development of military capabilities, and China is looking to export these with things like the PL-10E, dogfighting missile that seems to be being offered for export, but also the appearance of Chinese armed UAVs in places like Nigeria and Saudi Arabia as well. What that means for the West is there's a potential to come up against more highly capable weapons in more places in the future. And that's a trend that I think is continuing over the few years. So there's change, but also continuity.
When 2016 was a tumultuous year, surprise outcomes. Brexit was a surprise for many people. You look at it, the outcome of the American presidential race was also something of a surprise in terms of, even surprised the Trump team to have ended up winning. Let me take you to the question of the NATO alliance, the EU, and the future. President Trump, over the campaign, including as president-elect, had made some comments that worried people about, NATO, whether there was going to be a potential for a litmus test, how committed he was to the Atlantic Alliance. Last week, there were some statements that he made that were very encouraging for folks. Obviously, we do have the NATO ministerial, but the president has also been very skeptical about the EU and the link between the EU and American security, which has and then his statements also, if you look at the American first, as well as saying that the United States does not have to be central in some of the international organizations that it helped forge. What are some of the stakes, and what are some of the things that the international community will be looking at to see whether or not the United States continues to play, to lead from behind, as Barack Obama said and was criticized for, or whether the United States will truly be retracting from the world stage?
Well, I think it's better to look in a way at what's carrying on at the moment. U.S. security engagement is continuing. Deployments are continuing in Eastern Europe. It was intriguing, for instance, that the Secretary of Defense Mattis's first foreign overseas visit was to Japan and South Korea, reaffirming American commitment to those countries, and he did that explicitly. And he's done so explicitly to Europe as well. So there's change in the sense of the mood music is different, and there's greater focus on what Europe needs to be doing financially and also in capability terms. But I think really there'll be a greater focus on how useful are things like the 2% target? Isn't it better to start looking at what real capability alliances bring to security relationships? And I think allies will be looking to stress that benefit, to see where they can offer security benefits to the United States around the world, to try and share the burden in other ways. I think alliances and multilateral organizations also need to be better at just stating how good it is to work together for the long term. I mean, we mentioned the European Union, for instance. The EU in places like Africa that has a has a potentially large, significant security impact on Europe. We're seeing what's happened in the Mediterranean over the last few years. Those problems are long-term problems of security and instability, and they need to be addressed long-term. And I think, in a way, the EU has a lot of the mechanisms that best do that. For instance, working with rule of law institutions to strengthen the state so that we don't have instability erupting, in a sense that it then drives military attention. So I think alliances need to be better at demonstrating how useful they are.
Do you think that half of this is a public relations game to keep? Because for some people, it's self-evident that the Atlantic Alliance, for example, is the source of strength. Parenthetically, as a student of history, I will add there hasn't been an American president since Harry Truman or certainly Dwight Eisenhower that hasn't made the case to Europeans that they should be spending more. That's a recurrent theme, whether you were talking about the Carter administration or Reagan administration. And in fact, one of the things that President Obama was trying to do by leading from behind was to try to push Europeans to the fore in terms of taking sort of a more upfront stake in their security. How likely do you think it's going to be that the pressure from the Trump administration, the suggestions of litmus tests, the America First language, is actually going to drive European countries to actually spend more money?
Well, it already is. It's driving them to spend more money nominally, but it's happening in a very slow and sure way. The trajectory's up, but it's not up so quickly as some might like. And that, again, I think, as I said a minute ago, brings you to the utility of targets like 2% by the aim to reach that by 2024. In some cases, spending 1% might be enough. In some cases, 3% might not be enough. So I think it's important to look at it as on a case-by-case basis. There isn't a one-size-fits-all to security solutions across the world or to the development of national military forces. But bringing it back to what I was saying a minute ago, alliances have to be better at demonstrating, the European NATO members, what they bring to the table as well. I mean, if you look at UK mine countermeasures vessels in the Gulf, the Brits have got, I think, 16 in total. The USN that we track's got 12. That's a capability that someone else brings to the table, and I think alliances need to start messaging that, as well as focusing on financial targets.
And also economic development, right? So, French would say we might not be spending 2%, but we certainly provide, or the policemen of Africa, for example, where we spend a prominent role, including even in Central America, but also in the Pacific, given French possessions there. And if you look at it from a German perspective, Germans would say, look, but we economically invest very, very extensively in countries, even though our defense budget is not as strong. Should there be a greater acknowledgement of, as you're saying, a greater acknowledgement of those sorts of offsets for traditional spending? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I think security isn't just the use of the military tool. And stability certainly isn't. It takes long-term engagement. And I think focusing in some cases in certain unstable parts of the world on building the security sector in and of itself can sometimes have a deleterious effect on security. What happens if the troops don't get paid on time? I think questions like that, in some parts of the world are more fundamental than developing actual, offensive military capabilities, for instance. Stability in some places goes a lot broader across government. And in some cases, security can be developed by developing the greater institutions of state so that a state is able to project its influence across its territory rather than just deploy forces.
From a Russia perspective, obviously, Russian strategy has been rather brilliant. Try to destabilize EU countries. Obviously, there's a lot of reportage on Russian influence operations, certainly RT, but also propaganda operations, even financial contributions, particularly to some right-of-center parties that are looking for the dissolution of the EU. There have been suggestions that the Brexit campaign also got a lot of Russian support because by undermining, a key nuclear power. There was even the talk about Russian involvement in the Scotland Leave campaign because the British nuclear capability would go off with that. What are some markers that you guys are looking at, given that the President of the United States, despite some statements obviously by Jim Mattis and Ambassador Haley in the United Nations and Rex Tillerson that have taken a much more traditional tough line on Russia, the President of the United States has had a very soft, there was that criticism recently that, sort of this sense, at least in commentators in the United States, of the President giving equivalency to Vladimir Putin and the United States being sort of equally bad in terms of their price on human life. What are some things that folks in Europe are looking at? How is that rhetoric being seen? What's the Russia debate going to look like transatlantically over the next year?
Well, I think it's already post-2014. It's driven some of the security debates in NATO, as there's been a refocusing on heavy conventional forces and things like that. And of course, the alliance's moved back to reassurance for its East European partners. So of course it's been part of the debate, but I think in some ways it does vary across the continent. For some southern European states, the principal security challenge might well be coming from the south. The alliance now has to adapt to do all of that. And it also has to focus on the fact that it actually has been doing things like counterterrorism operations since 2001, when it declared Article 5. So in a way, there's just more challenges out there. The problem for some European states, in a way, is that the deployable capabilities have reduced significantly since the end of the Cold War. So more challenges, but less to do it with. I think in terms of what Russia's doing, we track more the development of Russian military capability and what Russia's doing in the display and use of its military force, particularly in campaigns in Syria, but also previously in its operations in Crimea and what it's doing around the borders of Ukraine. And there we can see some really interesting developments in the way Russia's able to exercise its security policy and deploy its armed forces. In Syria, for instance, we were tracking over the last few years, of course, the use of cruise missiles, submarine-launched, air-launched, and launched from service platforms, in some ways using them as a test bed, in some ways using them as a shop window, in some ways using them as a message. It was noteworthy, for instance, that when some of the first surface cruise missile launches were taken, they were nighttime launches, rather like 1991 in the Gulf War. So we're seeing utility and messaging taking place at the same time in the development of the employment of Russia's military force in Syria. But Russia's also using that to try and generate benefits for its modernizing armed forces. And you see that in some of the lessons they're starting to learn out of this. Actually, the acknowledgement that they are starting to learn lessons is an important sign that that's one of the reasons that they may be doing this and one of the benefits they may be getting out of it for their forces. And they differ across the forces. I think Land, Sea and Air will be drawing different conclusions from it. Land forces, for instance, they've shown a demonstrable capability to coordinate multilateral formations. Small units, deploy them at reach, but still there seems to be a deficiency in terms of tactical air control. There's a sort of capability that Western forces built up over 15, 16 years of combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's some progress in some areas, but not so much in others, but they're learning lessons.
What do you see as the financial impact? You know, over the years we've spoken, and you guys have been looking very carefully on the Russian economy and how much more pressure the Russian economy can bear. Very, very extraction-dependent economy, certainly on oil, but also other minerals and natural gas and the like. But you know, prices for those have been very, very low. Obviously, OPEC and Russia are working on raising those prices. Iran is a partner in that as well. Talk to us a little bit about how sustainable this is for Russia. I mean, parts of the modernization effort have faltered. We've heard that, you know, fewer astronauts are going up to, for example, Russian astronauts are even going to make it up onto the space station, in fact, in part because of financial challenges. You know, how much longer can Russia keep up this sort of divisive, disruptive game that is proving very costly, certainly, you know, in combination with the sanctions regime?
Well, in terms of the economic effect on military force development, I think people tend to think, well, the Russian economy, of course, has been hit by sanctions. It's been hit by the fall in oil prices, but oil prices will rebound as OPEC's decided to change its policy over the last 6 months. So it depends how the trajectory goes in future. I think in some ways there have been cuts in terms of the state armament program, but the way Russia's tried to deal with most of it has been gapping and delaying some projects. So the aspirations persist, I think. It just might take a longer time to get there.
Do you, what are... You know, obviously there's been a lot of discussion whether the United States is going to move to drop sanctions against Russia. There are multiple schools of thought, obviously, in U.S. security circles. One school of thought is, you know, and Senator McCain has been very clear, Senator Graham has been clear, but also some of Trump's own cabinet, President Trump's cabinet members have said, look, sanctions should stay in place. Russia has to leave Ukraine. Obviously, we saw some pro-Russian forces in Ukraine restart offensive operations last week. You know, but then you keep hearing from the president and those very close to him that it may be time to drop sanctions as a reset to get to a better place, to better combat ISIS. How would that be viewed in Europe if the United States does back away from sanctions? And do folks in Europe see it as a good trade to drop sanctions on Ukraine in order to better fight ISIS?
Well, I'm not going to talk about the hypotheticals of it all, really. I think across Europe, rhetoric has been a slight concern, but I think in some ways the the broad trends of the administration since it's been in power have been reassuring in terms of the continuing direction of American security policy. People might be talking about sanctions, but there hasn't been much movement on it yet. So in many cases, it's a wait-and-see approach.
You mentioned how Russia, used its operations in Syria as a true demonstration, right down to nighttime missile launches to sort of, punctuate the point that Russia has this long-range strike capability as well, this precision strike capability, just like the United States and obviously the UK, as somebody who's in the Tomahawk family as well. What were some other capabilities that Russia demonstrated last year that you found particularly noteworthy?
Well, I think sometimes it's worth not just looking at platform capabilities. One of the key things in a way is they've been able to sustain this operation for now about a year and 5 months. At the start, in maritime terms, the assessment was they were finding it a bit tricky because what they had to do was take up from trade 5 ships to actually help them in a resupply that previously had been conducted by an LST, the so-called Syrian Express. But now they've been able to maintain it. They're able to maintain the sortie rates. What they're doing in terms of aircrew now, in contrast, let's say, to the Georgia campaign, where they had to pull people from the test ranges and things like that, is cycle crews through from the regular Air Force. That's not just an indication that training is working across the wider force and that they've got more available pilots. It's that more people are getting operational experience too. And it's not just in combat air or attack helicopter capability, it's in transport capability, long distance resupply. In maritime terms, of course, there's been the interesting development over the last month and a bit with the deployment of the Kuznetsov. And that, I think, of course, raises other questions. Why did Russia decide to deploy its one aircraft carrier down there? Was it that service was trying to also demonstrate how it too could deploy capabilities at reach? But what it did was actually show how difficult it is to do that, because at the same time as Russia was there, Charles de Gaulle was in theatre, keeping up sortie rates. Russia lost 2 aircraft off that vessel. They will have learned from that, but at the same time it shows how difficult it is to conduct carrier operations. So in many senses, in naval terms, the benefits of the Syria campaign have been in the use of advanced capabilities like land attack cruise missiles from other platforms. But Russia will be learning from this. As I said earlier, one of the key things out of it was the acknowledgement that they're now learning lessons from this campaign. And one can look in the future to start seeing those lessons become integrated into force planning and force development.
Last question on the NATO alliance. Obviously, you mentioned that both in Newport and in Warsaw, the alliance made the commitment to bolster its strategic deterrent capabilities in terms of investment in conventional forces. That, there was a lot of focus on counterinsurgency, counter-terror operations for 15 years. It was a time to get back to basics because of the concerns about Russia. And that the counterterrorism role is probably best prosecuted on the EU side, both on police and diplomacy and the like. The American president has a couple of times talked about NATO as being obsolete and in need of retooling to a counterterrorism focus. Is that the right way for the alliance to go from your perspective? Or does the alliance have about the right balance now to shift and err more toward the side of strategic deterrence, which is really its core mission?
NATO, in a way, has to do everything. It has to satisfy the security drivers for its member states. And I think, as I was saying earlier, since 2001, they refocused on counterterrorism operations at global reach, let's say. They've now refocused back on learning the lessons of conventional maneuver warfare that they practiced during the Cold War. NATO, in a way, has to do everything. It's now acknowledging cyber as the threat across the alliance, hybrid activities, although some question the utility of that label. In a way, it has to do everything. And I think the alliance has continued to transform. It's continuing to transform at the moment. You have Allied Command Transformation working on what NATO's next transformation is going to be, its next strategic adaptation. The alliance is continuing to think about this. The challenge is, in a way, managing the capability list across its member states such that it's able to bring enough security benefit to bear, enough military capability to address full spectrum security challenges, not just at home, but also at reach.
James, thanks very, very much, and best of luck on the rollout of the report.
Thanks, Vago. I mean, at the same time, I ought to mention that one of the key developments this year is we're also rolling out the Military Balance Plus, our online database that digitizes the information on forces, defense economics, military capabilities held in the military balance and makes it more usable and searchable for the expert community.
And I can give it the strongest endorsement. Thanks very much again.
Thanks very much, Vago.